have indicated that you don't believe in systemic racism. What is your definition of systemic racism?
Let me answer the question that you've answered.
Or does it even exist in your mind?
Let me answer the question this way. One of the things I think about, and one of the reasons why I'm on the show, is because of the comments that were made, frankly, on this show, that the only way for a young African-American kid to be successful in this country is to be the exception and not the rule. That is a dangerous, offensive, disgusting message to send to our young people today, that the only way to succeed is by being the exception. The fact of the matter is we've had an African-American president, African-American vice president. We've had 2 African-Americans to be secretaries of the state. In my home city, the police chief is an African-American who's now running for mayor. The head of the highway patrol for South Carolina is an African-American.
Still exceptions.
Now, that was Senator Tim Scott on The View, and he was in discussion with one of The View hosts, co-host Sunny Hostin, claiming that his experience as senator disproved that systemic racism exists. Now, before Senator Scott went into that, Sunny reminded him of the systemic racism that still persists.
So when it comes to racial inequality, it persists in 5 core aspects of life in the US. Economics, education, healthcare, criminal justice, and housing. At nearly every turn, these achievements were fought, threatened, and erased, most often by white violence.
There it is, Sunny, it hit the nail. She hit several nails on the head, and that is what people tend to forget. And as the senator started ticking off lists of names, saying that we had a first black president and we have a first black woman vice president, talking about secretaries of states and chiefs and all of that. Ticking off a list does not mean that the system itself is fixed. Systemically, black folks are not where they ought to be in this country, and that is why it's called a systemic failure. It is not enough to just tick off a list of individuals, but in the minds of people like Senator Tim Scott and others who think like him, whether they look like black folks or not, because they don't understand the impact, the generational impact of systemic bigotry, systemic racism, systemic anti-blackness, they think they can tick off lists, and that means that Black America is doing okay. I will remind you of what I said before. I will say it again. I will say it every single time it is necessary. Hopefully people will understand this, that black faces in high places does not make up for the systemic failures, the systemic pressure cooker that black people as a whole find themselves in this country generation after generation. Is not a hard concept to understand if you would just free your mind and not listen to some of these talking heads who don't understand what systemic anti-blackness really is and how it has an impact. And we have a few examples of what Sunny, so kudos for Sunny for laying that out. We have a few examples of really what Sunny was referring to. We're gonna put those examples up to share those with you. Now, the real median household income in 2020, you see the gap between white, and we're talking about median household income between blacks and whites. Let's go to overall rates of poverty between whites and blacks. Do you guys see that? You see how big that gap is? Even when you look at the unemployment rate in this country, you can always know whatever it is for white people, you double that, sometimes almost quadruple that for the black community. Let's go to denial rates for home loan applications by race. Again, we see that Black America is in that yellow. 15.3%, Hispanic white, 10.6%, Asian, 7.9%, non-Hispanic white, 6.3%. So again, at the top of these lists where things are not good, you see black folks dominating in those areas. That is due to systemic anti-black racism. Racism is a general term, but when you talk about anti-blackness, that's really what you have to narrow down on. And this one, black people 5 times more likely to be arrested than whites, according to a new analysis. So we're talking about socially, politically, economically. all of the areas that Sunny laid out there. And then this headline right here, in the nearly 232-year history of the US Senate, there have only been 11 Black senators. Max, your thoughts about this conversation? I'm really, again, kudos to Sunny for laying that out and not just letting Senator Tim Scott get away with ticking off a list of a few people who have made it. And that's a beautiful thing that they have. I mean, we want to see that kind of upward mobility and changes. People do need to see themselves reflected in various professions in this country, no doubt about it. But again, just because a few Black folks have made it on up does not mean that the system is working for the vast majority.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I mean, honestly, every time I see Tim Scott at something like this, I ask why. Why is he doing this? Because he doesn't seem to be interested in actually debating ideas. And the only thing I can think of is at the end of the day, Tim Scott just has nothing really to say about race or the economy or anything. He's built by Washington consultants to talk about talking points that are inoffensive and don't threaten any groups. And yet he has this vision of himself as kind of this pioneer of a new Black conservative consciousness, except that requires challenging norms and challenging ideas. And if you answered a question on a test the way Tim Scott did here, you get checked off and told to go study more. I mean, it's just a low effort attempt that doesn't advance the conversation about race at all. It just puts us right back in that rut we're in Washington.
It does, and I don't understand why politicians like him, he's not the only one, they're really timid about really telling the truth about race in this country. How far, certainly we could talk about how far we've come. We also need to talk about how far we need to go. And part of being able to have an honest conversation about the present and also what the future could look like is really talking about the past and the connections, the threads that are still there impacting the present. And if we don't change course, will in fact impact the future. So you're right about that, Max. And I mean, he's from a southern state. He understands this. I'm sure his parents have endured some of this. His parents certainly have. I mean, South Carolina, for God's sakes. He knows this history, but why he's too afraid to actually tell the truth, I don't understand.